right. Good morning, everyone. Um, my name is McKay Erickson. I'm here with Red Summit Advisors, and I'm going to be visiting with you a little bit this morning on how to diversify your ranching operation. There's a number of things we're going to cover and talk about, all the different aspects of how you can, add some diversity to your ranch or farm, which can really increase the profitability, success, and even the happiness of you and your family in your operation. And so we're going to kind of cover a bunch of different aspects here today, but we'll just start with the first part here of, let's see. Okay, what does diversification look like? And so really, like, the definition of diversification, a couple of the definitions here. We have the process of a business enlarging or varying its range of products or field of operation. And this is something that has kind of been pounded into my head. And I think we really need to think about it a lot more as ranchers, is that our ranch is a business. we can't view it as just, something we do for fun or a hobby or just like how it is, how our life is. We need to view it as a business, and we need to run it as such. And so if we take this definition in terms of a ranch, it's the process of our business, our ranch business, enlarging or varying its range of products or field of operation, right? And so if we're a cattle ranch, most of us view our product as cattle, right? If we're a cow-calf operation, calves may be our product. And we sometimes can get caught in that trap of that's our only product and that's our only stream of income. And so we can get in trouble if we view it that way, and that's our only income. And so we need to really kind of broaden that mindset a little bit. The next definition there is the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, variety. And so that kind of goes along with having varying range of products, is just a variety. How can we have a bigger variety on our ranch? And so why have diversity, right? What's the purpose? Why do we want to do that on our ranch? And I think the number one in my mind is to reduce risk. And if we only have one product, if something goes wrong with that product, and we'll talk about some of those things here in a minute, but we can get ourselves in a pickle pretty quick, and we'll have a train wreck. And so by reducing risk, we can, increase the success of our ranch. And then also by diversifying our ranch in however many ways, we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, but we can increase the health of our land, soil, range, water, whatever it may be, our animals. I mean, the more that we can diversify things, the more that we can really increase. And honestly, in my opinion, we become better stewards of the land. And that's really what our goal is as well, is to be able to be the best stewards we can of the land, the animals. And by increasing diversity, we can do just that. And so then when we're talking about, diversifying our ranch, what is the opposite of that, right? What, especially in agriculture specifically, what is the opposite of diversity? And when I think about that, one thing comes to my mind, and that's monocultures, having a monoculture in our ranch. And so, like, I have this picture here that to me, that's really kind of the first thing that I think of when I think of a monoculture, right? Just one crop, one variety of plant that's just kind of dominant over the acreage. And that's in my mind as a monoculture. And so, a lot of times we think of that as on a farm as a monoculture, but it can happen on our ranches as well. And so when we talk about monocultures, right, we talked about diversifying our ranch, and as we diversify things, it lowers the risk. But if we just have monocultures, we're at high risk for a few things, right? Diseases, parasites, if we're talking about animals, genetic silos, market decline. So like for diseases, for example, if we just have one species of plant or animal, a disease could come through and just really wreak havoc on our animals, because we just have that one breed or one species of animal. Excuse me. And so, one disease could come through, but if we have multiple species, there are very few diseases that can cross, from species to species and harm if we have a lot of different species. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. And that goes for parasites as well. Very few parasites will work and jump from different species of animals. It can happen. I'm not saying it can't happen. And there are examples of that, but for the most part, in our livestock classes, that we can kind of diversify and help break the parasitic life cycles by having a variety of species. And then same with genetic silos, and that can come if we just are only running cattle. But if we're kind of breeding to the same line of cattle, and we're just in this, just imagine a silo, and our genetic tree is just kind of going up and up, and we're not branching out, we could run into an issue later down the road when we find out, that bull that we've been using and tracing back has some sort of a genetic disorder. And now, our entire herd has that gene marker in it, that we could get into trouble. And then also, like I said, market declines. Like if we're a sheep producer and the sheep market drops out like it has the last few years, we could be in real trouble. And so by diversifying, you can kind of have one part of your operation help the other when that market is down. And so I think this is a little more applicable to a lot of us in the Western states, on our ranches and on our rangelands. But this is just an example that came to my mind as a monoculture, and it's kind of what I think of when I think of a monoculture on the range, and it's crested wheatgrass. And this has been something that for the last years, many years, in these Western states, we've seeded millions of acres into crested wheatgrass. And crested wheatgrass is an amazing grass. I'm not saying anything is wrong with it. I just think it's a good example for us to illustrate how monocultures can work. And it was originally introduced for a number of reasons. It does great at helping, a disturbed area establish some forage to stabilize the ground, to reduce erosion. We originally brought it in to compete with halogeton in those areas where the sheep were grazing, so we didn't have that toxic plant. It's great coming in after fires, but it's a dominant grass, and when we put it in, it can dominate other native grasses, and then we just have one grass out there, crested wheatgrass. And it now, as we're trying to establish more of our rangelands back to sage, especially Wyoming big sagebrush, to help out sage grouse and other wildlife species. And even our livestock do well with some sagebrush on the range, but this crested wheatgrass makes it very difficult for sagebrush to reestablish. And so I just think this is an example that we can look at as a monoculture, that it does help in the short term to help kind of reestablish ranges, but we just need to be careful in certain instances of where we put any sort of a grass or anything that will just become the dominant species, and then we find ourselves in a monoculture. And we're talking about crops, and I think that's generally where the term monoculture comes from, but we also need to realize that this doesn't apply just to crops and plants. It can apply to animals as well. As if we just have one species of animal and one very specific genetic line of that animal on our place, then in reality we have a monoculture there as well. So this applies to animals. And so at this point, this is where I'd like to talk a little bit more about multi-species grazing. And this is a topic that I am a huge fan of and I get pretty passionate about, but I really enjoy the benefits that can come from multi-species grazing. And many of you probably have heard of Joel Salatin and what he's doing over there. He has a POLYFACE farm, which is out in Virginia, and he does some incredible things. And if you haven't heard of him, then I think you'd really enjoy. There's a lot of podcasts and different things out there. He's written a number of books. He goes around and speaks, but he's doing amazing things with multi-species grazing and different farming operations as well. But with his grazing, he's grazing cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, turkeys, ducks. I mean, he does kind of a little of everything. And by doing these different species, he's moving them around in ways that they complement each other. He has them very specifically follow each other in different patterns so that they utilize, each other's waste and prepare the ground for that next species to come through. He has mobile chicken hen houses that he can move across these pastures, and he's able to really improve the range that he's grazing those pastures. And he's kind of known for talking about having these salad bars for these animals. And when we think of a salad bar, we think of all these different options, not just one big bowl of one, lettuce, but a big variety. And that's doing our animals a big favor if we allow them the option to choose from a vast diversity of different forbs, grasses, and shrubs. And so as we continue to talk about multi-species grazing, a thing that I really enjoy is this term adaptive grazing. And there are many different terms out there for our different grazing patterns. As many of you have heard of rotational grazing, rest rotation grazing, intensive rotation grazing, mob grazing. There's many different terms out there. And I think that adaptive grazing kind of encompasses many of those. And it's really just the idea that we are controlling livestock densities and the time on the pasture in response to how that plant is reacting. And so we need to be able to monitor the range and know how to respond. And it's like I said, this is all about, time of year when we put that livestock on, how often we graze, how long they are in there grazing, what class of livestock we have. It's not really a way that we just have like, all right, we're going to be in each pasture for 3 days or each paddock, however we have it set up. It's more of a, it almost gives us more responsibility of knowing how to monitor our range and our pastures, how to know when they're ready to need rest, when to get our livestock off. And it just requires us to be, a little more detailed and be on the ground in the pastures, looking, monitoring, measuring. We need to know our plant ID. That's a challenge for me as I try to improve on that all the time. But we've got to know what plants are maybe our key indicator plants is to when, they are starting to disappear from the pasture, then maybe it's time to go. Or anything like that, but it can be really a great way and a great tool to improve our pastures and our rangelands as we become better monitors of our range ourselves. And as we continue to talk about this is from the Noble Research Institute, and they have provided a lot of great information on this, and they're doing some really cool things down there in Oklahoma. But when you use multiple species for grazing, I mean, and I think a lot of us just think of cattle and sheep or goats, but like I mentioned with Joel Salatin, pigs and chickens, and you can use it with all kinds of livestock species, but you can really utilize forages better. And we'll talk about this in a few slides about how different classes of livestock utilize different types of forage. And so you can utilize all of your forage a little bit better. It'll improve the biodiversity. It'll improve wildlife habitat and just increase opportunities for profitability and mitigate your risk. And so as we talk about the management for these multiple species, there are some things to consider. And so, we talk about grazing intensity and the density. And as we allow these animals to be, more, as we kind of pack them into a smaller area, this allows there to be more competition for the animals, which means that you can really utilize an entire area and target plants that an animal, if they were just left, very spread out, that they could really utilize some of these wolfier, weedier plants that we're trying to target. You can utilize temporary fencing. I think this is a lot of people that are doing this are using hot wire and different net fencing like that for sheep, but even like single strand hot wire, a lot of people are able to use, which means you can really customize the paddock or pasture into any size or shape that you want and do it pretty quickly. The more that you work with these hot wire fences, the more that you can really do it. And like this second point says here, that the design and shape, how you set that up, you can really kind of create narrow pinch points or necks in your pastures to just try and maybe tear up that ground a little bit more with a hoof action. Maybe it's in an area where you're creating a neck for animals to get to and from different parts of a pasture. And then also an important tool that I've really enjoyed is where you place your mineral or your water, depending on if you're hauling water in or where you set your water troughs, that wherever you set your mineral or water, the animals will naturally use those places more. And so if you look at areas that you think need, to be hit a little harder with the grazing, or you've got a weedy patch, maybe you go in and put your mineral tub there and allow those animals to hit that a little harder and kind of just be out there continually trying to move those animals where you need them most. Like, look at them as a tool, is really something I like to think about. But we have to consider that, there will be challenges if we try to add a new class of livestock to our ranch. And so depending on it, like if we're a cattle ranch and we want to add sheep, we really need to consider fencing as, a typical 4-strand, 5-strand barbed wire fence that we have for cattle really will be tough for sheep. They'll be able to get through that. And so we may need some net fencing if we're going to have sheep. And so we just need to consider all these things as we think about what class of livestock we'd like to add. Waterers, like if our waterers are built for cattle and horses and we add sheep, we may have to redesign some of our water troughs, as lambs do need water, and they're not going to get everything they need from the milk from their mom, and so they need access to that water, and so we need to maybe design some lower troughs so those lambs can get a drink. And vice versa, bigger ones, taller ones for cattle if we have sheep. We need to, think about predation. If we're going to add sheep, coyotes, wolves, bears, wherever you're at, they can wreak havoc on sheep sometimes. And so we need to be cautious of that. And we may need to add guard dogs or guard animals. There's a variety of guard animals, right? Llamas, donkeys. There's all kinds that we can add for those livestock guard animals. But we need to think about how we can mitigate predation on those animals. And then also, a lot of times we can't use the same facilities, the same working facilities, even sometimes the same trailers for hauling. We need different trailers if we're going to have a different class of livestock, but we do need different chutes, different ways to work and move and operate with these animals. And so that's something we definitely need to consider. And as well as minerals and supplementation, right? We all know that we have to be careful with sheep getting too much copper, and goats could be a concern as well. And so if we have different varieties of livestock grazing in the same pasture, we need to realize what threshold it is that, will be the least dangerous for the most at-risk class of livestock. And so we need to be very cautious of that. And then also, like, if we have horses or something grazing in a pasture, the same pasture where we have sheep or goats or cows, we can't have any sort of ionophores in a lick tub if a horse will get access to that, as that's toxic to horses. And so there's just a lot to consider there as well, that we need to have a mineral that is safe, for all classes if we're going to have them grazing in common or near each other. So there's a few things to consider there with that. But also, I think one thing that I really like to look at and has been very interesting to me is as you look at the differing markets. Now, this is something that I pulled that just shows the global. So this is the world price. This isn't just in the US. This is the global price of beef and then the global price of lamb. So in beef, those beef numbers and prices are there in red, and then the green is the global price of lamb. And so one thing I've always enjoyed is that, you know, they're not always up and down at the same time. You can see some trends where they both kind of trended upward at the same years and trended downward in the same years. But a lot of times when the price of lambs are up, the price of our calves and the cattle market is down. And then when one goes up, the other goes down. And so they can kind of, and it's not always 100% true, but very often we can see those kind of working with each other, complementary to, you know, maybe help offset when you have a down year in one market, you have an up year in the next. And then this is that same graph with, but we added the price of the global price of wool here. And I think that is an interesting thing to talk about as we talk about sheep, and I'll mention that here in a little bit. But so down here we have the price of wool, and these are right. So this is the cents per pound, and then this is the cents per kilogram, and so that's why they're on different scales here. But we can see that just adds another element of diversity and possible profitability for our ranch. And so these are some slides that I was able to get from Randy Sainer, who's the sheep and goat specialist at the University of Nebraska, and he was kind enough to share these with me. And this is something that I think is really important, that we mentioned earlier, that the different classes of livestock graze differently and they target plants differently. And so you can see on some of these graphs here that goats, you know, they on average, you know, and this can differ depending on how your pastures are and how your breakdown of forbs to shrubs to grasses. And so like goats on average they consume 20% grass, 20% forb, and 60% browse. They're very much more of a browsing animal. Then you get to horses, right? They're 90% grass. That's their thing. They don't eat much else. As you can see there with the other numbers, 4 and 6% on forbs and browse. And you go to cattle, are 60%, or excuse me, 70% grass, and then sheep are 60% grass, with the different breakdowns there of forbs and browse as to what they're consuming. And so as you look at those numbers, you can kind of think about, well, maybe I have a pasture that has a few more forbs. Maybe I ought to have more sheep in there to help knock those down, and you can utilize that forage a little better. Here's another illustration about that. How they, a lot of people will say that, goats are just browsers, sheep just eat forbs, cattle just eat grass, and that's not true to be that absolute on those things. That, really they consume a little of everything, but they just tend to lean a little bit heavier into one or the other. And another great thing with sheep is the control. And this is for example, this is leafy spurge, but this can be true of many different weeds, or not even weeds. They can be just a plant that you may have a lot of. If you're in Texas and you have a lot of mesquite and different things, then maybe you can bring goats in to help control that a little bit. I know there's a lot of challenges with mesquite, but there's many different brushes that we can maybe thin out a little bit with goats. But you can see in this illustration here that the pasture there on the right has had sheep come through, and then the one on the left, there was a hot wire fence you can see between the two. But the pasture with the sheep, they've knocked down that leafy spurge pretty good, and they can be a great tool to utilize as cattle. Sometimes they just won't even deal with leafy spurge, and it's a big challenge. And so by bringing in a different class of livestock, you can use them as a tool to help control that. And this once again is from Randy Sainer, who got this information from Mike Wallace there in Nelson, Nebraska. And the advantages of using different classes of livestock is, you know, with your cattle, you can, well, obviously we're diversifying our sources of income, but cattle are better at deterring predation, especially in areas with just coyotes. I mean, coyotes will still be a challenge, but there's still ways of doing that, and cattle are a great way of helping with that. And then there are some other advantages of cattle, right? They're easier to move in general, um, than sometimes sheep can be, but they they are able to, you know, be managed in a pasture. Different things that we can look at with sheep is that not all sheep have wool, right? There's different classes of sheep. There's hair sheep, which are becoming a very, very popular class of sheep, and so that will reduce the need to shear, which can be a huge pain for a lot of producers. And so by using these hair breed sheep, so we can eliminate that. We can lamb at a different time that we calve, so that we're not on top of each other. We can spread that labor out a little bit. Once sheep have lambed and those lambs have grown a little bit, you can mix them right in and graze them right with cows. The benefit of sheep also is that you can, those lambs grow so fast that you can raise them and wean them and get them out of your pasture that fall in October and send them down the road. And so there's a few different things that you can do by adding sheep to your operation. And then this is another slide here from another producer there in Hay Springs, Nebraska, that the benefit of adding sheep to cattle is there's a number of things that are beneficial with having sheep, but there are some things to consider, right? And so I showed you that slide a little bit later, that wool is now a possible source of income, and that we can look at wool as another stream of income at a different time of year where we may need some income. Family friendly is something that lambs are easier to work with for children. Sheep are in general. I mean, if you just have a handful of sheep, you can crowd them into a corner and doctor them and sort them and do what you need without having to have a lot more heavy duty panels and corrals and chutes as you do when you're handling cattle. There's just a bunch of different advantages there. I won't go into too many details, but then some of the disadvantages that you have is that, lambing can be a challenge depending on how your facilities are. And so if you're out lambing on the range, like it says there, cold rain in May can be an issue, but if you lamb with wool on, that can be helpful, but a lot of people don't want to lamb that with wool on, and so that can be an issue as well. But there are, the H2A program is great to help, as we have herders, that's a great program to help pay for herders and get herders here. But like I said, we need guard animals, we need guard dogs. And so if we've never dealt with any of those, it can be a steeper learning curve, but people are great. There's a lot of new people out there that you can meet and learn from, and they'll love to help you out. And so now I'd like to move into the other reasons, right? Not just diversifying your plant species or your animal species, but also a little bit more of your plant species. And so why would we want to diversify your range or your pastures with different varieties of crops? What's the benefit there? And so there's some different things that we can look at here. And this is something I really have learned more about, and I don't know a ton about, but I'm still trying to learn more. But we have our cool season grasses and we have warm season grasses. And so we can look at those ratios, and those will differ depending on where you're at in the country. But as we have different blends of cool seasons and warm seasons, that gives us a greater grazing period, essentially, or period of growth that we can, balance out our peaks in quality of forage, so that our animals are grazing more quality forage as those cool seasons peak in the early spring, and then the warm seasons kind of take over, and then the cool seasons come back in the fall. If we can really utilize that, it can be a game changer. And then also looking at different varieties of forbs, legumes, shrubby species. And then the more legumes we have, the more we know that those are nitrogen fixing plants. And so we can increase the health of our soil by fixing nitrogen into our soils in the range or our pastures, which can benefit all the other surrounding plants. And so, the more that we look into this, the more that we realize that the greater diversity that we have in our pastures, it does many different things, but it also creates a habitat for all kinds of beneficial insects, beneficial bacteria in the soil, and different things which can protect the plants and help the plants resist disease and different things. And even there, that last point, that some of our brassica plant varieties, they have natural insecticide properties. And so there's so many different things that we can do to just naturally help the range in our pastures if we just have a good diversity of plants. And so I have this little, and I'm sorry that's showing up a little blurry, but it shows the different root type and how roots form for different types of plants, brassicas, all the ones with tap roots, as you can see there, or just the different rooting pattern for all these different roots. And by doing that with all those different roots, it shows how they can complement each other. And yes, some of them will, outcompete others, but the more that we can really increase diversity, the more that we're improving our soil health as well. Another great thing to think about and talk about is cover crops. And the more I learn about cover crops, the more it excites me about how we can use them as such a great tool. And this can apply for if we're grazing them or not. If we're just having a field out there that needs a cover crop, then putting them in can really improve. There's some really neat research out there on cover crops, but really we can just utilize a longer and fuller growing season as we take advantages of the time that the initial crop is not in the ground. We can utilize more of the growing season either on the front end or the tail end of that crop. By having that cover crop in, we're capturing more moisture into the soil, we're reducing erosion, and that is huge. We're also suppressing weeds and nematodes with those cover crops. Like I mentioned before, that is now additional forage that you can graze. And by allowing those animals onto that ground, we are then utilizing their hoof action, we're utilizing their manure, and they're fertilizing the ground. We're increasing biomass in the soil, as I showed you on that slide a couple slides back. All those roots and different root patterns in the ground is just adding biomass into the soil. And then also a big benefit, and we'll talk about wildlife here in a little bit, but it provides winter food, cover, nesting, all kinds of different benefits for wildlife. And then also, if they're flowering crops, they can be huge benefits to pollinators and beneficial insects, which is something that we really need. And I can't really help myself without talking about the health, the ruminant health, as it's one of my most favorite topics. And so we talk about ruminants as that's our major class of livestock, right? Cattle, sheep, goats. That's really what we're dealing with most of the time. And so these ruminants have evolved on range where they have a choice, right? They're able to choose from a variety. And if we're talking about bison, if they didn't have what they wanted, then they could just migrate. And so this is how their ruminants have really evolved to be able to choose what they need and to increase their own health. And so they're able to seek out, if they're able to seek out a balanced diet, they're able to balance out their own vitamins and minerals and what their body needs. And there's some really cool research out there that they know what they need. Their body tells them what they need, and they're able to seek it out and able to mitigate deficiencies by selecting the plants that they need where they're deficient in those minerals. And so as we allow them access to a more diverse range and pasture, we're giving them that salad bar that Joel Salatin talks about. And this allows them to get a wider variety of these kind of nutrients, excuse me, that we talk about. Phenols, carotenoids, terpenes, and antioxidants that we don't really talk about a lot. We talk about protein, energy, and then we talk about some of our bigger minerals, calcium, phosphorus. We may talk about vitamin A and D, but you know, there are so many more micronutrients out there that can benefit the health of our animals. And one great way of doing it is just increasing the diversity of our pastures. And so I also would like to talk about just as we have these pastures, there's a couple of different things that we can do to help the health of that rangeland. And so we need to think about what we need to do to, you know, help those, especially in times of drought or anytime there's maybe fires or damage to those ranges. And so we need to think that if we're trying to replace any sort of a grazing forage with hay, that if there is any fresh green growing grass or something poking up, that is much more palatable than dry hay. And so even if you're going out and dropping hay into a pasture, trying to replace grass, they're going to choose the, you know, the fresher, more palatable, excuse me, forage over that drier hay. So that means that you just have to be cautious and cognizant that, you know, by just thinking, oh, I'm going to just go drop some hay out in this pasture, it may not really, because they may go eat all the grass first, then come eat the hay, and you may have just wasted your hay, and they got more than they needed. And so that's something to think about. So maybe if that's the case, then honestly, maybe locking those cows up in a dry lot and feeding them hay would actually be a greater benefit if you have that option to preserving your rangelands. I know that's not always an option. It's not always possible, probable, or make any sense logistically. And so that's just one thing to consider. And so that's just something to think about as we're talking about stretching pastures. And then as we continue that topic, as we're talking about supplementation, maybe there are some better options to feeding hay, as there's different options of supplementation out there. If we feed you know, some sort of a co-product, right, like range cake or a processed grain, that might be a way of improving, as there's some really neat research out there about supplementing a little bit of protein can actually improve the efficiency of the digestion of those poorer range grasses and help those cattle digest them more, get more out of it, and actually improve the quality of that grass as it's digested in those animals. And so also you can see there at the bottom, there's some general rule of thumb about supplementing with salt and how we can use salt as a intake limiter. If we're worried about the cows just really wolfing down our supplement, we can kind of use salt there as an intake inhibitor. But I think the biggest key, and I mentioned it a little bit before with the monocultures, is that and with the adaptive grazing, we need to monitor and measure. And so that's how we know that either the health of our range and pasture is improving or that it's going downhill. And so the best way is to get out there and monitor. And so whether you go out and clip grasses and clip, you know, and send them into a lab, and this is something I really don't enjoy doing that. It's one of my least favorite things to do, is to go out and clip pastures and take those samples, but it's so necessary to know how you're doing, how you're managing that grass. And there's a number of samples out there, or excuse me, a number of labs out there that can process those samples and give us really cool data as to the quality of our plants out there on the range. And there's a lot of really good resources out there as well with the NRCS, local university, your state university that has the extension services, those people are more than willing to come out and help help you know, and they are some of the smartest people out there in the range world and in the plant world. And so they are very capable of knowing how to help improve your range. And then also, you know, in addition to clipping and sending those to the labs, there's photo points are a great way of doing that as well, as we just come to a certain place with the GPS location, take a picture, and then just do that year after year. We can actually learn some really cool things about the health of our range. And so that's really the key is we have to monitor and then also, and once we monitor and once we know, we've got to make that decision, right? We've got to know, hey, if I need to get my cows out of here because they're overgrazing, then we need to get them out of there. We can't just continually degrade our pastures because that's just going to harm us in the long run. Another way of diversifying your ranch is by utilizing wildlife. And I know that wildlife can be kind of a touchy topic for a lot of ranchers. And it can be a difficult thing, but there are ways that wildlife can really help with profitability. And so there are areas in this country with either the sage grouse or the prairie chickens. Now there's a lot of contention out there with both of these bird species, but the more that we learn about managing these rangelands, the more that we learn, and that saying holds true, that what is good for the herd is good for the bird. And so as we manage those pastures and our ranges for our livestock a little bit better, that's improving the habitat for those ground nesting birds as well. And so that's really something that the more that we are able to improve our management as livestock operators, the more that we can help these birds, which in turn helps us stay on the land. And so the more that we manage and graze properly, there's research out there that shows that this improves the amount of these insects that these ground dwelling birds consume, which is why they are always in areas where we've grazed our cows. And so that's always something to consider. But there are some other benefits, right, to our operation for wildlife, as it can really be a huge income boost for hunting, as hunting can be a great income generator, as well as tourism. There's a number of ranches around the country that make a lot of their money off of tourists coming and photographing and just going on wildlife tours to see, some of these wildlife species during breeding season or during cool times of year. And so that's an opportunity there as well. Some states have a tax benefit if you're improving habitat for wildlife. And there are other states as well that have wildlife conservation programs, as Colorado, I know, has ranching for wildlife, and different states have those programs that really help ranchers get some funding to improve their range and their ranches. And they're really cool opportunities. Nebraska also has some opportunities to receive funding for projects to improve the habitat for different wildlife species. And you just do a number of things. Like I have this picture here of this wildlife ladder in stock tanks. There are many things like that as you do those on your ranches, there are opportunities to receive some assistance there. Like I said, there are, this is in Texas, they have an option of really reducing your tax liability on your land by improving it for wildlife. And it allows you the same exemption, tax exemption, as the ag exemption, which allows livestock producers, if they need to destock during times of drought or other unfavorable conditions, and allow that habitat to still be managed for wildlife while you're in a drought situation, and not have to pay the full tax load there. And so that's really something that's a benefit for those producers in those areas. Some other considerations as you're looking at wildlife is it goes back to the same as what we were talking about with the health of the range, is that you've got to monitor. right? And so we need to be out there. And if we have key species of wildlife on our ranch, it's great to keep notes as to how often we're seeing them, where we're seeing them, what kind of numbers we're seeing those animals in, so that we know that our management is helping those animals trend upward or downward, or however it is. There are some things, like I mentioned, that are good key indicator species, right? So if we have more ground nesting birds, that means that we are monitoring our grasslands properly, and we have healthier grasslands, as those two are directly correlated. A big thing for wildlife are those areas where there's water, right? That's key for everything in areas where water is in limited supply. And so those areas where we have wetlands, ponds, or streams, those are areas where we really need to manage those properly. And then this also gives us the opportunity to work with local wildlife agencies and build those relationships, which can in turn, come back and help us as we have issues with wildlife. If we have elk coming in to our alfalfa fields, or if they're eating off our haystacks, and we have a good relationship with the local wildlife agencies, then they can come, in turn help us manage and get those wildlife away from our haystacks or whatever damage they're doing. And now as we move on, this is another topic. We mentioned it a little bit before with the wildlife, but the terms agritourism and agritainment are really gaining a lot of traction in the world right now, as more and more people are removed from agriculture in their lives, and there's still an inherent craving or need to learn about it. And so this creates opportunities for us as farmers and ranchers to have those people come in and learn more about what we do, and it can be a great stream of income as well. And so these two terms, like I said, they're kind of interchangeable in a way, but loosely, agritourism is a way to invite people onto our operation and have experiences, and learn the kind of a more in depth. And then agritainment is more of a, come on to our farm or our ranch, and there are some fun things to do here. But like I said, those two are kind of interchangeable. And so just some options and ideas here are, doing the wildlife tours, having hay rides, corn mazes, pumpkin patch, having, if you have orchards or fruits, have people come in and pick your own produce. There's petting zoos. We can kind of have a dude ranch operation and do horseback rides, things like that. You can just have a bed and breakfast or an Airbnb rental, short-term rental on your place, where people can come and stay. I know people that do kind of a weekend where they have some sheep and they shear the sheep. Then they have a class where they teach them how to spin the wool and then knit the wool, dye the wool, whatever it may be. There are youth ag camps, and those are becoming really popular, where kids can come to a farm for a day or for a week and be taught and learn and work and gain a better appreciation for agriculture. Hunting and fishing, we talked about. There can be, demonstrations and classes, and then he's also just camping or recreation, outdoor recreation on the land that you have. But there are some things to consider, depending on where you're at and what state you're in. There may be licenses or permits that you need to do these things. Some states offer, they have laws in place that protect the producer or the operator of whether it's horses or other agriculture, but you may need to look into liability insurance. If you do, something that's really, really popular, like a pumpkin patch or a maze or a corn maze in the fall, that gets really crowded, you need to consider where are those people going to park, so that you're not having them park on the neighbor's front lawn or something that's going to upset your neighbors. And so that you need to consider those things. And then also, just the increased traffic on your land, what's that going to do to the health of your land and your animals? Is it going to stress them out if you have hundreds of people driving by all your animals every day? So just some things to think about. And then also lastly, there's other ways other than what we've talked about to diversify your operation, right? If you have mineral assets, that can be a great way to add some additional income. Oil or gas, mining. If you have gravel, you can have a gravel pit or lease that out. You can utilize your water for lease if you're not using all of it. You can have utility easements, energy developments, solar, wind, um, custom haying. You can lease out your haying, and then if you have some timber, you can utilize that as an additional stream of income as well. And so, uh, really, once again, just to kind of wrap things up, why diversify our ranch? Why do we want to diversify the operation? And really, in my mind, like I said, reducing risk is the biggest thing. That's really what we want to do, is reduce the risk, add some additional streams of income so that we can increase our profitability as our ranch and keep that business going. And like I said, view it as a business so that we and our families can stay on the land. That's what we really want, is to be able to stay on the land. And also, as we do that and we diversify, we're increasing the health of our land, soil, and water. We're becoming better stewards, which also, again, increases our ability to stay on the land as we are improving it and helping it, stay sustainable for years and for future generations. And so, if there's any questions, I'll answer those the best I can at this time. But if not, I thank you for your time. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you want, you can type one in the chat, or you can unmute and ask one, and we'll do the best we can to answer. All right. Well, we won't spend any more time then, but again, if you have any questions, Phil, we do. Looks like we have something come through the chat here. Can you discuss any resources or support networks available for ranchers who are interested in diversifying their operation? How can they access valuable information or connect with ranchers in this field? And that's a great question. Like I said before, I think there are some really great resources out there for ranchers. And I think if they go work with their local NRCS offices, soil conservation, the wildlife agencies, local university extension, I think those are great opportunities to build relationships with those people, as they're invaluable with the services that they provide. But they are also, I mean, that's their profession, is knowing how to improve the health of your range, your animals, whatever it may be. That's what they do every single day, and they have a vast amount of knowledge and experience. And so as you reach out to those offices, they're always the most helpful, friendly people to come out and see your place. We also have a comment here that farmers.gov is a great place as well. But yeah, I think there's numerous areas where you can reach out and find resources that can help. Even just your neighbors are, however they're improving their places, they would be more than happy to help. And so I think that there's just a plethora of people out there that are very helpful, and that's why I love this industry. Is there's just everybody's friendly and willing to help. But thank you again so much for your time. We'll wrap things up, and we will talk again. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you again.